Hey everyone, and welcome to the follow-up video for uploading a CSV file using Python. In the previous video, I talked about using np.loadText as a way of reading in a CSV file or any type of generic text file with a given delimiter. This is an optional video in the series, but I think it's a good one because it's going to introduce the idea of loading text and CSV files using Pandas. Now, Pandas, like NumPy or Matplotlib, is an external Python package that is geared towards data frames and data management. One of the benefits of using Pandas over say np.loadText to load in CSV files is the speed at which the data gets loaded into Python. Now, if you're only dealing with a small set of data, or even a medium set of data, you probably won't notice the difference. But when you're dealing with big data sets, for example, say, a data set dealing with maybe 10 to the 7 samples with 3 different variables, loading efficiently is going to be a really important aspect of your programming. So we're going to start by, again, reading in this falltimes.csv. We're going to start by importing pandas as PD, just like we would import NumPy or Matplotlib. In fact, let's also add in import NumPy as np and import matplotlib.pyplot as plt. Let's put this in line, so matplotlib inline, so that we're watching our graphs populate within the screen. And let's add a new cell where we define our variables so we don't get confused. Okay, so as I said before, Pandas is a way of loading in tabular data. And one of the benefits is speed, but also another benefit is the fact that you don't have to worry about separating out headers. If you remember in the previous video when we tried to load in the header or the CSV file with the headers of our object's drop times, we would get an error. In this case, Pandas takes care of that. One of the downsides, well, it's not really a downside, but one of the things that we have to be aware of is the fact that when we read in the fall times CSV using Pandas, it's not going to be stored as an array. It's going to be stored as a Pandas data frame, which is an object that you can manipulate, which has its uses. So let's load in this falltimes.csv, and let's take a look at the type of the variable. So here you see that it's going to be this Pandas data frame object. And I'm not going to go into a deep discussion of what objects are right now, but you can think of it as, kind of a very helpful variable where you have certain methods or certain functions associated with that variable that you can call. Kind of like how when we use NumPy, if we wanted to say call arange or linspace, we'd say np.arange or np.linspace, where that function is associated with that package NumPy. In this case, we're going to have different methods that are going to be associated with this fall times object. So one of the first methods that we're going to look at is .head. So again, if we want to specify the object that we're going to work with, we're going to specify the variable name, which in this case is fall times. We're going to use a period to say, okay, we're going to call it a method that's associated with that object. And in this case, it's going to be the head method, which basically shows what your tabular data looks like from the top down for the first couple lines. Now, if you're using the IPython notebook, it's smart enough where you don't have to print the statement, and you could just say falltimes.head and it'll actually even populate in a more pretty way. But for good programming practices, we're going to follow the standard Python protocol where we're going to do print, use print statements. So here we can see that our data frame is laid out very much like a CSV, where we have the rows and the columns. The rows are specified by an arbitrary index number, and the columns are given by headers, the positions. So the first thing that we're going to want to do in this case is we're going to want to be able to start accessing values from this object. If I say I have my data frames object, let's get rid of this for right now, and let's say I try to access an index of it. So file times, let's spell that right, 1, I get an error. Basically because Pandas is associating values not necessarily as an array, but as this data frame object. So in order to access these objects, we're going to have to query the header files. So the first thing we're going to do is we want to say, create an array where these header files are, or rather header strings, are stored in an array that we can access. So again, because this is an object, it's very powerful, and it has these built-in methods that we call. So if we want to store the headers as an array, we call that object file times, right here. Of that object, we're going to call the methods columns, and of that columns method, we're going to call the function values, in which it's going to take the values, i.e. the headers of the columns, and store it in this array. If we print this variable, we see automatically that these are stored as an array. We can tell by the brackets and the strings. If we wanted to access, which we will later on, a specific index of this array, we can do it following standard index notation, by just putting in brackets and the value we want. Okay, so now that we have that, we're going to be using these values inside this header array to access our data. And we can do that by calling the calling of our array file times, and say we want the positions header. So we're going to be indexing file times based on the positions array. And of that array, we're going to specify an element. So this is saying I want all of the file times from the first drop. And if I print it, I see that I have a new object. Oh, and I have an error because my # was in the wrong spot. Let's rerun this. And so here we see that we have an array, well, not quite an array, but a variable defined where we have all of the positions for our first drop times. I can query more drop times, say if I want the first 3 or the first 2, because when you index, Python doesn't include the last entry. I can use that using the colon operator. So I'm able to call multiple sets of data given this type of indexing. So if we check the type of this variable, we're going to see that it's not stored as an array, but rather as a Pandas series object. For right now, that's not going to be too much of a bother for us, but we should say that if we wanted to do some kind of matrix multiplication or some kind of mathematical computation, we would want to convert this to an array using np.array. So now let's say if we wanted this very first set of data, which is the first drop time, which is 1.66. I could index this just like I would any other array. By first, let's call the object, so fall times. I want the first header of fall times, so that's going to be positions of 0. And now I want the first entry of this indexed fall times position. And here I go. I have the first drop time for my array. If I wanted the first drop of my second position, I would change this to 1. If I wanted, say, the first 4 drops, or the first 3 drops, I could specify it just as if I was indexing in any other array. Right now you might ask why we're dealing with it this way. It's just a quick way of introducing pandas. Pandas is very powerful, in which we could then associate specific dictionaries, which we haven't talked about yet, to keys and query data. But mainly this has just been an introduction to what you can do with pandas and its power in terms of being able to deal with strings and essentially act as a way of dealing with databases. One last thing before I conclude this video is just to show you that we can call these Pandas series objects in plotting functions easy enough. So here I have the fall times for the first position. I could store this as a separate variable, as I discussed in the last video, but again, we want to try to optimize our code as much as we can, so we don't want to store every column of a data frame as its own variable. So here I can create a histogram by saying plt.hist of this distribution, which is calling the fall times data frame, and I want all of the data from the first header, which is the drop from 20 meters, and I want to show this plot. I can press Shift Enter and it runs, and I have a histogram. Well, I hope this was a useful introduction to pandas, albeit it's brief. There will be an entire series dedicated to using pandas in the future, but again, I wanted to introduce this as a powerful way of dealing with CSV reading as a means of introducing pandas, and hopefully you'll use this in the future for loading any type of CSV or data file. Thank you for checking out this video, and if you want to see more, you can check out my YouTube channel at rwilcoxklein, or you can check out my GitHub where you can get all of these IPython notebooks for your records.